And we are taking the capabilities that were inherent in that product and that company, marrying them with the technology and the capabilities that we've developed over the last 8 or 9 years in onshore wind. And with that, we think we can bring a significant solution to the table for offshore wind that will help resolve some of the challenges that the industry is facing today. And then taking that technology and deploying it here in the Great Lakes, specifically Lake Erie, which has a significant offshore wind resource and very uniform conditions in wind resource and water depth, we think that you might be able to achieve the economies of scale that offshore wind hasn't achieved today, and with that, share the vision that Lori has to actually be able to drive significant cost out of this form of electricity and hopefully get it to be a very competitive form for the future.
Thank you, Rich. And now just a few questions for the panel to kind of stimulate some conversation. And I'll start off with Lori. Rich was just talking about the economics of offshore wind, and you mentioned in your comments the question about costs. What do you and your fellow panelists think about the future of the economics of offshore wind, and why does it represent a good opportunity for us here in Northeast Ohio?
Well, to me, there's two parts of it. One is, as Rich mentioned, Lake Erie is it's a fabulous resource in many ways, and from a put your production hat on, your industrial hat on, it is a fairly uniform lake in terms of geology, lake bottom depth, wind resource, not very far from shore. So, it has some attractiveness to do things that haven't been done before. And if you look at the way offshore wind has been, and as Rich was saying, is that every project has been unique. And in some projects, every single turbine, every single foundation has been unique. And just thinking about what has gone on in the world in almost every energy industry, from nuclear to gas turbines to coal production, in the beginning, you have an engineered solution. And eventually, the engineered solution becomes productized. And I think that's the direction that gives us great anticipation that we can accomplish what we're saying we can do.
Do you want to add to that, Mark?
The thing I wanted to add to that is I think one of the toughest challenges at the policy level is I think there are really two questions about the cost, and that is what will the electricity cost the first day it begins to operate, and what will it cost in 10 or 15 years? The reality is that the feedstock's price will never change. You can't say that about nuclear, gas, or coal. Once you achieve the economies of scale with a major deployment, you've locked in a price for that electricity that will be there for 20, 30, or 40 years. That's very different than our traditional sources of electricity.
Rich, what are some of the technological advantages of the GE design, and what kind of improvement opportunities do you see to help improve the economics?
Yeah, I think the major difference in our technology as compared to traditional wind and offshore wind is traditional wind turbines are geared. So you have the rotor that spins at a certain slow speed and a generator that spins at a relatively high speed, and in the middle you have a gearbox to change the slow speed to high speed. And those gearboxes, they require maintenance and occasionally require repair. And those repairs onshore can be managed quite easily with the cranes and the conditions that you have onshore. But take that same situation and move it out into the water, becomes very difficult. Number one, to maintain that gearbox over the life of the turbine, but number two, in the event that you have a failure of that gearbox, becomes a very costly exercise to change it. Our design does not have a gearbox. It's what's called a direct drive design. So the rotor, the blades are connected directly to the generator, so they spin at the same speed, which means you have to have a different technology in the form of the generator. But in removing that moving part in the middle, you can have a step change in reliability. And just as an example, I mean, take for if you have your car, if the transmission goes at 100,000 miles, what do you do? It's a difficult question. How's the rest of the car, et cetera? But offshore wind, if you look at the cost of changing that gearbox out, there's a good chance, depending on what your tariff rate is that after year 15, you won't do it because you won't recoup the cost over the life of the asset. So now you're talking about reducing the life of an asset. So if you take into account the repair and maintenance cost of a gearbox direct drive becomes significantly advantaged.
Mark Shanahan, Lori Wagner made some kind comments about the state in terms of its permitting and the regulatory.
He's a brilliant man.
Aren't you all? all three of you. Could you explain a little bit about the regulatory process by which the state evaluates the potential for offshore wind development? And Lori, maybe you can dovetail with that. How is LEEDCO working with the state in sorting through that?
Well, I guess the first thing to point out is that in any of the regulatory process, one of the hurdles we're trying to get over is we're working with statute and rules that were written years ago and did not contemplate renewable energy, let alone wind offshore. And so we're trying to make structures work that may not have been designed to accomplish this task. Given that, what we're trying to do is avoid, frankly, a major catch-22. Submerged land leases require that the applicant prove that they can make use of whatever the project is and that it will be successful, or at least it will probably be successful. Power siting requires that in order for them to even think about whether they believe the project will be successful, you have to have site control. Well, that means that submerged land lease process says, well, if you don't have a power siting certificate, you can't make electricity. And the power siting process says, yeah, but if you don't have a submerged land lease, we can't give you a siting certificate. So what we've tried to do is take those two complex processes, let each of them carry out their statutory mission, but to put them on a completely parallel path so that they each get to the conclusion at the same time, and a project does not get caught in that catch-22. In order to move that along, we've developed a notion on the leases of granting options. And options can allow access to the lake, and retaining the option and moving to the lease can be tied to specifically identified metrics of progress of the project, so we can both keep it moving and avoid the speculation. There are about 7 agencies that are involved at that at the state level. That's not counting any of our federal partners who have jurisdiction. The governor set up a task force about a year and a half ago of all of those agencies. We meet on a weekly basis. We regularly are on phone calls with LEEDCO. And what we're in the process of doing now is trying to figure out what are those questions we have to ask about this project and what are the answers we need to reach in order to let it move forward.
Lori, is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, I think, excuse me, as a non-legal or regulatory person, I found it, you know, when I made that comment about the state, I had been on the Power Siting Board previously as a public member, so I was pretty familiar about what the rules and regulations are, and they are they're very tight, and they also are very good. But when I'm on this side of the fence with LEEDCO, and we're sitting there, and the permitting people are across the table, we've had real conversations, real discussion about what is said on the paper, because we're crafting a strategy. So it's a partnership. It's not, here's what the rules say, so you got to figure out how you're going to do it. And so I think everybody who's been part of those meetings will agree that, at least to this point, it has been a very open and collaborative process, and I think that's what it's going to take to be successful.
Rich, and then for each of you, how would you declare success 10 years from now? What would success look like?
I think success would be the gigawatt is achieved, and it's achieved with the cost of electricity that's competitive. Actually, it probably won't be achieved if it's not, so that's almost saying the same. And it achieves the goals that the LEEDCO is trying to set out in creating the industry right here in Ohio and the Lake Erie region.
Mark, what would
Agree with that completely.
Yeah, I would say, Rich's comment is that if we get to 1,000 megawatts, the cost will be where it needs to be. And then I guess what I would do is turn and look back at what it's done for the state in terms of development, and then say, have we been successful?